Good afternoon, everyone. So, as I was so politely introduced, my name is Joe Gladstone. I'm an assistant professor at UCL in London, and I study money and happiness broadly. Now, why would you want to listen to academics talk to you about spending and happiness when really you could just look at your own lives? You could look at your bank statement this month, look through that for different things that you bought over the last month, and you could think, well, what made me happy? You know, when was I happiest? Was it after that dinner I bought? Was it after that electronic product that I bought, that new iPad? What was it that made you happy? And the reason that I think that academia or science has a lot to offer us in trying to understand this question is that so much of life is based on correlation. And lots of the survey evidence that we just heard from Claudia was also based on correlation. So correlation just means that as one thing goes up, the other thing goes up. So maybe this month in your bank statement, it said that, oh, this month I spent a lot more on consumer goods. You know, I spent a lot more on electronic products, and I was happier. So that must mean that electronic products made me happy. But the problem with correlation is that it doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean causation. So just to illustrate this, here's a nice correlation. This is per capita cheese consumption correlated with the number of people who died strangled in their bed sheets. And as you can see, this is a beautiful correlation. As cheese consumption went up, so did the number of people who died in their bed sheets at night. Now, I don't think that anyone would say that one caused the other. It wasn't the case that people who ate lots of cheese, then that caused them to die in their bed sheets. But as one goes up, the other goes up. And similarly, when we talk about happiness, I think that we really need to consider this. Is it the case that when you bought all that stuff, that made you happy? Or is the kind of person who, in general, is happier, might they have different preferences? Might they like to buy different types of things than someone who is, in general, less happy? And so most of the evidence that I'm going to talk to you about today is going to be based on experiments, based on things where we might have given people money, just given them cash, and then said, hey, we would like you to spend this in one way or a different way. And then we try and measure their happiness over time. And we think that this might be a better way of trying to understand how money relates to happiness. Now, again, why is it that you can't just look at your own life and decide for yourself how spending relates to happiness? I'd put this down to the fact that, in general, we are bad intuitive psychologists. What I mean by that is that we aren't actually always very good at understanding what drives our behavior or what makes us, or what motivates us, what makes us happy. So here's, and if you ask people what makes them happy, I don't think they get it right. I think they often give you really bad answers that has no relationship with what the evidence says makes them happy. And to illustrate this point, I'm just going to give an example. So this is a real example of where this sign was put up outside a museum in London. And the museum contacted the police because basically they realized that there was a lot of pickpocketing, a lot of thefts happening to tourists outside this museum. And so they felt, okay, well, the best way to tackle this is that if people know that there's going to be lots of thefts happening, then they're less likely for that to occur to them. So they were intuitive psychologists themselves, they saw a problem, and they tried to answer it using their kind of naive beliefs. Now, particularly for the gentleman in the room, could you maybe tell me what one might do if they saw this sign? If you're walking down the street and you saw this sign, what might be your immediate reaction? I think it might look something like this, something like that. And basically, what they found is that after introducing the sign, the number of thefts doubled over the subsequent few months. Okay? And that was because it was much easier for the thieves to stand there, wait for someone to walk past, touch where their valuables were, and carry on walking, and you just had your perfect target just there. So here's an example of where we're bad intuitive psychologists. We don't always know what motivates others, and we don't even know what motivates ourselves sometimes. And so just asking people, like, what kinds of stuff makes you happy when you buy it, that might be a really bad way of trying to understand that question. Okay, so if you do ask people what would make you happy, very often they will say it's money. Very often, even for people who you might not expect this to be the case. There was a great study done through Barclays Wealth in the UK where they surveyed millionaires, people who only people who had many millions of pounds invested. So these are highly rich people, and if you ask them how much money would it take for you to go from kind of a 7 on a happiness scale to an 8, people, no matter if they were had a few million invested or tens of million invested, they said about 3 times more money. If I had 3 times more money, the things I could do, the things I would have. So money is one of the things that people tell you will make them happier. But as we just heard from Claudia, the relationship between money and happiness is not simple. I mean, so if we think about, according to kind of economists, money is what drives everyone. It's what they think about all the time. It's the main motivator. It's what they dream about at night. But when you look at the evidence about does more money lead to more happiness, it's much more mixed. So, Claudia really set out some of the basics of what I'm going to talk about, but you can see that, life satisfaction barely changes when GDP goes up. Over a certain kind of level, there's almost no relationship between more income and happiness, over about, $75,000 or so. But within countries, there does seem to be a relationship between happiness, either across countries or within countries. So there does seem to be this mixed relationship. We do see some evidence for money equal happiness, but not others. Now, what my main proposition to you is today is that maybe the reason that money does not have this very linear, simple relationship with well-being is simply because people in general are not spending their money right. Maybe it's the case that if people, no matter what their income was, were to spend money differently, spend it on different things, then that would increase their well-being. So some of this is nicely kind of summarized in a book called Happy Money by Elizabeth Dunn and Michael Norton. But basically, there's been a lot of research on this over the last 10 years or so, and that's what I'm going to talk about a bit today. So we do have some basic principles about what kinds of things seem to be that when you spend more money on them, people seem to be happier. And again, these are based on experiments where people have been given money or just told to spend money differently, not just based on asking people how they spent money and then seeing if they were happier or not. So one of them is one that's been widely kind of expressed in the press, one that most people probably have some understanding of or have heard about, but basically experiences and not stuff seems to make people happier. And again, if you ask people what makes them happy, they'll say money, and second, they'll say something like an iPad. They'll say some material good. So if you ask people in general, they'll often give you a material response about what makes them happy, but that's not what the evidence says. Experiences, not stuff. And here's a nice kind of illustration of this from the Wall Street Journal that was conveying this, that part of the problem is that people in advance don't think that experiential goods will make them happy. So you can see that first row. If you ask people to forecast how likely would this thing make you happy, for the experiential purchase, they give a lower answer. They say, I don't think that that experiential purchase will make me as happy. But if you ask them after they buy that thing or buy that experience, it's actually the experiential purchase that consistently seems to make people feel happier than the material purchase. And this is one of the main reasons why it's thought that experiences make people happier. It's because you don't just enjoy the experience at the time, though you might well do enjoy it at a time, but you also create memories about that experience that you can enjoy more than once. Whether it's sharing the conversation with your partner or friends who you took that trip with or did that day's conference with or whatever else it is, experiences are enjoyed more than once. And that's one of the reasons that they're thought to, per capita, make people happier than material goods. it's also one of the key kind of themes of what seems to make people happier when they spend money is to spend on a variety of things. So if people just keep buying the same stuff over and over again, it doesn't increase their happiness. But if they spend it on a variety of things, it does. And for me to explain why this is, I talk about something called hedonic adaption. So again, this is something that's kind of related to what Claudia mentioned, but the basic idea is that we adapt very quickly to changes in our lives. Okay? So we just simply, we just adapt to anything that really happens to us. We're very adaptable creatures, and that's one of our evolutionary advantages. And so, I mean, just to think about what kinds of things which we know should make people happier, to what extent do people adapt to those things? You know, so if you were to ask people what kinds of things make me happy, they might say something like marriage. They might say, getting married, that's what really makes me happy. But the reality is that in these giant surveys that some of the things Claudia was talking about, yeah, before, people do seem to be a bit happier as they're getting towards marriage. You know, they meet someone lovely, they settle down, they move in, but doesn't last. No, we adapt back to a set point. Marriage, definitely not. Birth of a child. You think that maybe having children make people happier, but no, definitely not. Definitely. And probably this is more like the lack of sleep than the lack of children, because actually in the long run, having children makes people feel like there's more purpose to their lives. So over the long course, having children might be better, but in the short term, we adapt, and actually seems to have a negative effect for the first few years on our general well-being. But even for things that are bad, even for things that we think will be terrible, like something like widowhood, again, we adapt back to a set point. We actually even get happier at the end, though that's probably because the person was like ill beforehand and things like that. So in some ways, this is like both a positive and a depressing story. So the depressing story is that nothing will be as good in the long term as you thought it was going to be. If you were waiting for something in life that was going to suddenly spark your happiness, oh, I'm going to finally retire and it's going to be the best thing ever, that actually, no, you'll just adapt to that and that won't bring you happiness in the long term. But similarly, if something terrible happens to you, you know, whether it was you became ill and disabled or whatever it was, in general, people do adapt back to a set point. And so these kind of changes don't seem to matter so much. And so that's what explains why if you spend money on a variety of different things, you're much less likely to adapt to those things. So just to give you like just another example, like, you know, there was that horrible unicorn drink that was sold in Starbucks, you know, really sugary, like full of like colors. Maybe it was more of a thing in the US, but basically, if you were to buy that, your treat, every single day of the week, what I'm saying to you is that would bring you less pleasure over time. And that it's important to try and spread your spending, even if you've got your favorite thing that you like to have each time, it's not going to bring you the same level of increase in well-being every time you buy it. Another thing is about spending money on others. Now, this could seem surprising because in reality, obviously, spending money on charity or spending money on others should also help them. So you'd hope that it was in some way a selfless act. But it doesn't need to be a selfless act because it actually increases people's well-being. And just to reiterate this point, this isn't based on asking people, did you give money last month? This is putting money in people's hands and saying, I want you to spend this on yourself. And they could have chosen anything. They could have chosen to buy, you know, some lovely meal for themselves. They could have chosen to buy whatever they wanted. Or I want you to spend this money on someone else. That could be a homeless person. That could be your sister. It could be anyone. And what we found is that when people spent money on others, they were consistently happy for, you know, over a longer period of time. And the final kind of theme I want to talk about is about prepaying to avoid the pain of paying. So what I mean by that is package holidays, for example. So even though they're very unfashionable now for you to buy a package holiday all up front where you get the flights and you get the hotel booked in, you get everything in one go, that actually there's very good evidence that this does make people enjoy that thing a lot more. Because during that time you're on that package holiday, you don't consistently have to experience the pain of paying, the feeling of discomfort you experience when you pay, consistently throughout that period. And neuroscientists have put people into FMRI machines, functional magnetic resonance imaging machines, and measured people's brain activity while they're paying for stuff. And the same parts of the brain that light up when you experience physical pain, like literally they stab people with needles and compare, is the same bits of the brain that light up when you're buying something. So that pain of paying, that discomfort, that's real. That's a real feeling. And if you can minimize that by paying upfront and then enjoying the feeling that everything's free over a period of time, people enjoy that a lot more. So next time you're thinking about going on holiday, do consider finding ways to pay upfront to enjoy that experience a lot more. And one of the reasons for this is something that was discussed before about loss aversion, that basically people just care a lot more about losses than they do about gains. So just as an example, if you were walking down the street and you were to find a note, like a cash note, I'm saying that you would be twice as annoyed if you were to lose that note, if you were to lose, whether it's 20 euros or 500 euros or whatever it is, you'd be twice annoyed as if you were to pick up that note and gain it. Now, what I'm going to talk about for the rest of this is about sort of my own research that tries to dig in a bit deeper into this question of what kinds of things make people happier when they buy them. And so this is work with Sandra Matz and David Stilwell that was published last year. And the title is Money Buys Happiness When Spending Fits Our Personality. And so my basic premise is that we have these rules about what kinds of things seem to make people happy with their money that have been consistently shown across many, many different studies across many parts of the world. But those things seem to ignore the fact that each one of us is different to each other. So it's not the case that we're all the same. We're not some mass of people that can all be treated the same. I am different to you, and you are different to the person sitting next to you. And so surely it can't be the case that there are these single rules that apply equally to everyone. Surely we have different preferences, we have different opinions, we care about different things, and so that must be part of the story of how we could spend money to improve our own well-being. And so, just to give you an example, let's think about charitable giving. So if we know that spending money on others seems to make people happier, that surely can't be true for like an Ebenezer Scrooge or some other character who doesn't care at all about other people. Surely we would expect that effect to be stronger for people who really cared about others. And so what we base this on is this idea of personality. So in personality psychology, there is this very standard formula, which is that there are 5 key things that separate each of us from each other. There are 5 dimensions on which each of us is different. And those are the simplest dimensions to easily explain the broadest range of differences between all of us. And that acronym can be called OCEAN, O-C-E-A-N. So O is for how open to new experiences you are, how intellectually curious you are. C is for how conscientious, how organized you are, how hardworking you are. E is for how extrovert you are, how outgoing and sociable you are. A is for how agreeable, how kind of nice and warm and kind you are. And N is for neuroticism, how basically moody and emotionally unstable you are and how kind of annoying you are. And so those are the 5 things that separate us each from each other. And so what we did in this research was we took a very large data set from a bank. And so with this bank that I was working with, we managed to convince them to survey a very large number of their customers. And we measured their personality using a standardized long-form questionnaire. So we measured what kind of person they were. And then we matched that with all of their transactions with the bank. And so we only looked at people who this was their main bank, and we, again, could tell that for various ways. And so this is a data set of many, many millions of transactions, tens of millions of transactions, matched with the personality of their customers. And then we also measured their well-being over time. And so what's this based on is this idea of psychological fit. This idea that basically, if people are matched with their environments, matched with what's around them, then they, in general, seem to be happier. So people like stuff better when it's more similar to them, and those who experience this match seem to be happier. So here's a nice example of that. Like, the BBC did a study on this with 600,000 people in 2015, And they basically found that different regions of the UK could be kind of described differently based on their personality. So basically, people in general live close to people who are kind of like them, and that different areas have a predominance of certain personality types. So, for example, you can see that Scotland, under B, is actually a very kind of nice, warm place. And so maybe they should secede, because they're much nicer and warmer than everyone else in the UK. And so basically you can see this pattern. And what they also found is that when people lived in places that everyone around them was similar to them, then they are also happier. So this is kind of what we're basing our theory on, is that when people will spend money on things that match who they are, then they will be happier. And so the way we do this is by each of these transactions, each of these thousands of different things that people could buy. They could be buying, going to a hairdresser, buying a taxi, like whatever it is. We had each of those things rated by thousands of workers online, and we had them rated on what they perceived those products or services to be in terms of their personality. So it sounds weird, but bear with me a second. So imagine like flowers, you buying flowers. Is buying flowers like a nice, warm, agreeable thing to do, or a nasty, horrible thing to do? Is going out to a club like a very outgoing and social thing to do, or a very introverted thing to do? Those are the kind of questions that these thousands of people answered. And so each kind of spending was attributed a personality. And then we ran a big data analysis and showed that basically people who spent more money on things that matched who they were actually happier. So here's just some ratings that we got when you standardize everything together. And just to give you a sense, people who are, say, high or low on extraversion, people who are highly extroverted spend about £52 more a year on going out clubbing. People who are highly conscientious spend about £124 more a year on gym memberships and things like that. And basically, people buy things that match who they are, according to this big data analysis, and that those who buy more of the things that match who they are happier. Now, one of the things I think is so important about this is the applications this has with big data. So what big data has recently found is that you can actually predict what kind of person someone is just from the data available about them online. So lots of researchers looked into basically predicting people's personality from their Facebook data, for example. So here's an example of where the different likes people have on Facebook. This is based on a data set of about 7 million people, where they measured their personality, like using these questionnaires, and then like related them to their likes. So you can see that extroverted people liked parties, they liked socializing, they liked meeting new people, like dancing and cheerleading. And very introverted people liked Stargate, they liked manga, they liked Final Fantasy, which is a video game, they liked Battlestar Galactica, and computers. Now, obviously, I've chosen these examples because they make sense to us. But the reality is that based on these 7 million people this data set's based on, you can predict with such a high accuracy that that prediction is much better than if you were to ask someone's best friend, what kind of person is your best friend? Is your best friend very outgoing and social, or are they very introverted? The computer model does a better job of predicting who they are according to themselves than their best friend does, or their family does. And so here's an example of how good these predictions are. So these predictive models, like based on this Facebook data, could predict, and just think about these as percentages, like how good the percentage accuracy is. So in 67% of the case, they could predict if someone was single in a relationship, if their parents were together at the age of 21, if they smoked cigarettes, if they drank alcohol, what race they were, what religion they were, whether they were gay or straight, and their gender. But also the predictions are super high. It's harder to explain them because they're not dichotomous, they're continuous, with people's personality as well. And so my conclusion is really that happiness might not depend so much on how you spend it, but what you spend the money on. And we have these principles about how people should spend money, but we shouldn't forget about their heterogeneity, about how different people are. But more importantly, for the subject of digital happiness, I think it's so important to think about that with all this big data that is basically public, that we'll never be able to constrain it and keep it to ourselves, that companies have this new opportunity to predict the type of person you are from your purchases or from your large data, and they can use that information to provide you with products or services that match who you are, when the evidence says that if people buy more of things that are like them, then they're happier. So if you think about an Amazon recommendation system, that right now Amazon serves you with things that you should buy based basically on what they think you're most likely to buy and therefore most likely to bring them profit. Maybe instead they could rephrase that and say, hey, we're going to recommend you these different purchases because we think that these purchases would increase your well-being, would make you happier. You think about Netflix, rather than saying, we think you're going to like these films or TV shows next, maybe it's, we think these films or TV shows would bring you greater happiness. That's a whole different relationship between these tech giants and the consumer. And the science is all there to say that this is how these things work. So with that, I thank you very much. Cheers.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Joe. Very interesting. I have a couple of questions, but the first question that is really on my mind is how much did Amazon pay you to say that their surveillance is actually making us happier?
So it's not their surveillance, it is the fact that and they don't do this now, but they could do it, where they could change their recommendation system to basically try and recommend people things that would increase their well-being. Whereas right now, all they're basically doing is recommending people things that they think is going to maximize their profit, which is perfectly reasonable, but it's not the same relationship that you might have. And you could think about something equal with banks.
But aren't you going over the line? I feel quite creepy suddenly when I realize that I'm watched all the time, and when my bank starts to watch what I'm spending money on, and then I don't know if I really like that world.
People,
I don't know if I have a choice. Maybe it's already happening. But
people claim they care about privacy.
Yes.
But when you actually give people a choice and you say, hey, you can have your privacy or you can have $1. Which would you like? People value privacy about 41 cents.
Well, what is
so
interesting
there's no evidence to me that people care about privacy.
What is interesting, that what we learned from Claudia, is that people mind about their own privacy, but not about yours, right? You cannot know what I make as money, but I should know what you make. So I'm interested in this hedonic adaptation. Eh? So is that the same thing that when I was in a plane for the first time and they had Wi-Fi connectivity over the ocean, I was completely amazed about this technological wonder, right? Your signal goes into space to a satellite and bounces off, and I could suddenly, over the Indian Ocean, receive my email. But then very quickly, the next flight, when the system wasn't working, I was actually very pissed off. I said, well, what kind of... Is that the hedonic adaptation, that you start to see first the wonders of technology, but then take it for granted?
I think your example sums up both that, and it beautifully sums up the loss aversion as well. So basically, if you were to use the Wi-Fi the second time, and it was to work equally well, you would get less pleasure from that than you would have done the first time, and the third time you'd get less pleasure than that. At the same time, if it doesn't work, then you'd be twice as pissed off, basically, that it didn't work, as you would have been pleased by it working. And these can all be summarized in these mathematical formulas that have been, proven again and again over the decades. So some of these things are not really debated anymore. They're just accepted as the foundations of decision-making and human behavior.
So, and now you said something that I have very difficulty of understanding, and maybe that's because I'm Dutch, but you said that giving away my money actually makes me happier. I mean, that's very foreign to me. So how does that work?
So I think what's really interesting is that for some of these effects, there are ceilings. So yes, spending money on experiences make you happy, but if someone was to spend 90% of their money on experiences and was to live in a tent, they probably wouldn't be happy, right? So there is probably some kind of ratio or amount. But we actually have no sense of what the ceiling is on how much money people could give away to be happy, because in general, people don't give any money away. They give a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of their money away, but we know that every increase they give money away, it does seem to bring them pleasure. So I think a really fascinating future bit of research will be about, like, is there a ceiling? And if there is a ceiling, you know, where is it? Is it 1%? Is it 5%? Is it 10%? But yeah, the evidence is very consistent that you giving your money away brings you pleasure and a sense of well-being.
Okay, very good. So thank you very much. You will hopefully join us for the debate that we will have later on, because I'm sure that some of the other speakers might have different opinions. I don't know. So we will see.
That's welcome.
So Joe, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.